When Morgan Freeman's car suddenly breaks down outside a forgotten auto repair shop on the outskirts of town, all he wants is a quick fix. But when he stepped inside, he found an elderly mechanic working alone under dim fluorescent lights. Working with tired hands and quiet determination, this man would leave a lasting impression in Morgan's memory, not just as someone who fixed his car. A week later, Morgan stopped by the garage again to thank him. But when he arrived, he found the shop closed and the doors locked. The truth he soon learned would shake him to the point where he froze in place. Before we continue with the story, share with us where you watched it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of stories, because tomorrow we will have a completely different story for you. As the sun set over Los Angeles, a golden glow spread across the city streets. Far from the city center, in a modest old auto repair shop, Arthur Beckett wiped the grease off his hands with an old rag and took a deep breath. Arthur, 72, had spent most of his life around engines and machinery. His small and humble garage had survived for years despite the big garages and chains. This was because he worked by earning trust, not by showing off. But trust wasn't enough to pay the bills. The slight discomfort he had been feeling in his chest so often lately returned. He pressed his hand to his chest, his face wrinkling slightly. It was probably just fatigue, he thought. He had no time to get sick. Just as he was getting ready to close up shop, the sound of a car with an erratic engine filled the street. When he looked up at the entrance to the garage, he squinted and saw a classic black Mercedes approaching. A car like that should have belonged to a luxury showroom rather than his small workshop. The engine misfired several times and finally died. A short while later, the driver's door opened. Out stepped a tall man dressed in a smart black suit. Slowly removing his glasses, he had a confident and calm demeanor. It was as if he had stepped out of a movie scene. The man walked towards Arthur with a measured and polite expression. "Good evening. Could you take a look?" Arthur looked at the car, then at the man. He saw a familiarity in his face, but he couldn't place him. He was probably a wealthy man who had come to have his expensive car repaired. He muttered with a slight snort. "Too much luxury. Not my style." The man smiled slightly. "It's a car, isn't it?" Arthur grinned slightly. "An engine is an engine." Without another word, he grabbed his toolbox and opened the hood. He hadn't even realized that the man in front of him was Morgan Freeman. Arthur leaned into the engine, and with his years of experience, he quickly realized the source of the problem. He checked the parts, examined the connections. The man watched him with his arms crossed over his chest. "Do you run this place by yourself?" he asked. "Always." Arthur's voice was firm but gentle. "Nobody really fixes things anymore. They just change parts and charge people exorbitant prices." The man nodded. "I respect that. You have the soul of a true mechanic." Arthur smiled wryly. "That's right." But as he tinkered, a sudden sharp pain shot through his chest. He frowned, but pulled himself together. It was a minor strain. It would pass soon. After all, he had a job to do. Morgan Freeman continued to watch him intently. Arthur mumbled as he adjusted the belt inside the engine. "I can fix this. I just need a few minutes." But what he didn't realize was that this customer was no ordinary man, and the man in front of him would change his life forever. As the Los Angeles evening cooled, Arthur Beckett's shop was still warm with the smell of oil, metal, and labor. Arthur, his sleeves rolled up, keys in hand, was tending to the Mercedes engine. A tall man in a smart black suit watched him silently. Arthur had seen this kind of people before, rich men who admired their expensive cars but had no idea about their engines. But there was something different about this man. Arthur muttered to himself as he leaned into the engine. "Too much wire, too much technology. They don't even let you really feel the machines anymore." The man smiled slightly. I respect people who do their job properly. Arthur snorted and gave a light laugh. Then you're in the wrong town, my friend. The man smiled quietly, but said nothing. Arthur continued to work on the engine. He adjusted a belt, turned a key. He had fixed thousands of cars, and this was no different. But this time his breathing was heavier than usual. The pressure in his chest was growing. Still, he didn't care. He had a job to do. And Morgan Freeman kept his eyes on him. "Have you been doing this a long time?" he asked. Arthur answered without raising his eyes. 50 years. I opened in 1974 and haven't closed since." The man nodded, impressed. "That's not very common nowadays." Arthur wiped his hands with an oily cloth and studied the stranger carefully. "So what do you do?" he asked. The man smiled slightly. "I'm in the entertainment industry." Arthur raised his eyebrows. "Music or movies?" The man hesitated for a brief moment, then answered, "Movies." Arthur snorted slightly. "I guessed it. Someone from Hollywood and driving a Mercedes." "Of course." The man laughed, not seeming offended by the comment. On the contrary, he seemed amused. "It's not mine. I borrowed it from a friend, but I like cars," he joked. Arthur nodded in agreement. "At least you appreciate them. Most rich people think of their cars as mere toys." The smile faded slightly from the man's face. He shook his head slowly. "I've never been interested in toys." Arthur turned back to the engine and grasped a key, but he hesitated. Suddenly there was a sharp burning sensation in his chest, the pain spreading to his ribs. He gasped, his vision blurred for a moment. The pain eased a little, but his hands trembled slightly. Gritting his teeth, he pulled himself together. He had been suffering from this kind of pain for a long time, but now he had no time for it. Forcing himself to keep moving, he tightened the last screw. The engine was now running, and that was all that mattered. Arthur stepped back, wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Okay, you can try it now." The man got into the driver's seat and turned the ignition. The engine started, strong and smooth. Arthur crossed his arms and nodded his head in approval. "There, that's it." Adam smiled, his hands running over the steering wheel. "Great." Then he got out of the car and reached for his wallet. "How much do I owe?" Arthur shook his head from side to side. "Nothing. I'm happy to see a working engine." The man paused for a brief moment. He looked genuinely surprised. "Are you sure?" Arthur replied with a slight wave of his hand. "I don't charge for such simple jobs. If you have problems again, just come back." The man looked at Arthur carefully, then bowed his head with a sincere smile. "I will, and next time I'll bring you a coffee." Arthur chuckled, "But not one of those fancy Starbucks coffees." Laughing, the man got into the Mercedes and rolled down the window. "See you soon, Mr. Beckett." Arthur just grunted and followed the car with his eyes. He didn't know who he had just helped, and how this man was going to change his life. As he prepared to lock the shop door, he felt another tightness in his chest. For a moment he had difficulty breathing. He held on to the door frame and waited. As usual, the pain gradually eased. Shaking his head from side to side, hospitalized, he sighed, then turned off the lights. Another day, another car. But some days were different from others, because Morgan Freeman couldn't forget the man he had helped that night. And when he returned this time, he wouldn't come empty-handed. The engine of the Mercedes hummed softly. The cool air blew gently against Morgan's face as he drove through the silent streets of Los Angeles at night. His hands rested loosely on the steering wheel, but his mind was elsewhere, not on the road. His thoughts kept circling back to Arthur Beckett, the old mechanic. He was a hard-natured, stubborn man, but honest and trustworthy. He was a rare character in this city. Morgan had known countless people in his life, actors, directors, billionaires. But Arthur was different. There was nothing fake about him. There was an authenticity that left no room for pretense. and Morgan felt he had to know more about this man. When he got home, he grabbed a glass of water and pulled out his cell phone. Calling his assistant, he gave a clear instruction. Arthur Beckett, Los Angeles, auto mechanic. Send me anything you can find out about him. Soon the first result came in. An old, outdated website. No flashy branding, no big ads. Just this simple text. Beckett's Auto Repair. Honest workmanship since 1974. After a while, a message popped up on his phone. Morgan opened the file from WhatsApp. Inside were several low-resolution photos. A young Arthur posed proudly in front of his shop, a wrench in his hand. Scrolling further, something caught his attention. Forum posts. His assistant had forwarded some of the comments customers had written about Arthur over the years. Morgan began to read them carefully. I was broke and my car broke down on the highway. Arthur fixed it for free and told me not to rush to pay and to bring it in whenever I could. I never forgot that. I had to make my shift, but my truck broke down. Arthur fixed it after his shift and refused to charge me extra. My father took his car to Arthur for 30 years. When he passed away, Arthur fixed up my dad's old Chevy from top to bottom, just so we could take him to his funeral in his own car. Morgan gripped the phone tightly. This man was not just a mechanic. He was a cornerstone of his neighborhood. But outside this small community, no one even knew he existed. Morgan leaned back in the chair and stared at the phone screen. He hadn't spent more than an hour with Arthur, but he knew one thing now. Arthur Beckett was no ordinary man. He was one of the truly good people, and good people didn't deserve to be forgotten. Her eyes drifted back to the phone. Her mind was working fast. She had to thank Arthur somehow, but not with money. Arthur wouldn't accept money. He had already refused payment once. So what would Arthur value? Morgan thought back to their conversation in the garage. He remembered Arthur talking about how modern mechanics had lost the spirit of the job by just replacing parts. He talked about how the mechanic's mindset had changed, that the old days of manual labor were disappearing, and that's when the perfect idea came to him. Morgan smiled slightly. This wasn't just about doing a favor. Morgan picked up her cell phone. She had someone to call, but before she could press the button, her device vibrated. When he looked at the screen, he saw that it was his assistant. "Sir, I don't mean to bother you at this hour, but I thought you'd want to know about this," his assistant said, her voice a little agitated. Morgan frowned. "Is it important?" "Actually, yes. A man named Bill has been trying to contact you. He made a lot of calls and said it was urgent. They reached out to me, so I wanted to pass it on to you. And he gave me another name, Arthur. He says he needs to get in touch with you. I can share his number if you want." Morgan was stunned by what he heard. Without wasting any time, he took the number and immediately started dialing. After a few rings, a timid voice was heard on the other end. "Hello, is this Morgan Freeman?" Morgan immediately straightened up and sat up straighter. "Yes, it's me." The other person took a deep breath. "My name's Bill. I run the laundromat right across the street from Arthur Beckett's store." Morgan gripped the phone a little tighter. Why was this man calling her? She spoke, trying to suppress the uneasy feeling that had crept up inside her. "Yes, Bill. Why are you calling me?" Bill hesitated for a moment, then his voice filled with concern. "Look, I know this sounds weird, but I saw you at Arthur's store tonight, and, well, I thought if anyone could help him, it would be you." Morgan's heart began to race. He had a bad feeling. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice serious and determined. Bill was silent for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Arthur's in the hospital." Morgan's body suddenly shivered, as if a cold wind had passed through him. He had planned to go to Arthur's shop tomorrow, but now he realized that perhaps tomorrow would be too late. Some debts could not be postponed, and Arthur Beckett deserved more than just a forgotten story. Without wasting a second, he grabbed his jacket, grabbed his car keys, and rushed out the door. He had a bad feeling. This didn't feel like an ordinary hospital visit. When Morgan pulled up in front of Beckett's auto repair, the streets were quieter than usual. She parked her car and took a deep breath. The garage, normally dimly lit, was completely dark this time. A single sheet of paper stuck haphazardly to the door caught his attention. When he got out of the car and approached the entrance, he saw the following words written on it: "Closed until further notice." He gritted his teeth. So it was true. Arthur wasn't here, and from the state of the store, he hadn't been around for a few days. Morgan was still digesting the situation when he heard footsteps approaching behind him. Turning his head, he saw a man in his 60s, wearing a worn flannel shirt, standing in front of the laundromat. The expression in his eyes was familiar. It belonged to someone who knew something. The man bowed his head slightly and spoke. "You must be the one who came here tonight." Morgan nodded slowly. "Bill." Bill responded with a sad smile. "Yeah, I'm sorry to call you so suddenly, but I thought you should know this. Arthur didn't know you, but I know you, and believe me, he could use your help." Morgan asked in a patient but determined voice. "What happened?" Bill took a deep breath and ran a hand through his gray beard. "Arthur had a heart attack tonight." Morgan's insides tightened even more. "Where is he now?" he asked. "He's at County General Hospital." Morgan nodded and headed for his car. Just as he opened the door, Bill called after him. "I don't know how much this concerns you, but Arthur kept this shop going for his grandson. He lost his son and daughter-in-law in a terrible car accident 4 years ago. His grandson, 13 years old, is an orphan, and Arthur and his wife look after him. This is their only source of income, and they are not doing well." Morgan stopped where he was. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath for a few seconds. Then, without saying anything, he got into his car and started the engine. When Morgan Freeman stepped into the emergency room of the hospital in the dark of night, a deep fear gripped him. The faint glow of fluorescent lights, the whispers echoing through the corridors, and the distant sound of monitors, it all seemed to hang in the air. His heart was racing. Her throat tightened at the thought of Arthur here, clinging to life within the cold, insensitive hospital walls. Approaching the reception desk, she asked in a hoarse voice, "Arthur Beckett, which room is he in?" The nurse took a quick glance and shook her head with a deep sigh. "He's in intensive care. His condition is critical. No visitors." Morgan took a deep breath. She couldn't just stand there and wait. She had to be with Arthur. Maybe this was her last chance to say goodbye to him. "Please," she said, her voice shaking, "just a few minutes." The nurse hesitated, but she saw the desperation in Morgan's eyes. She bowed her head slightly and pointed down the hall. "You have 5 minutes." Morgan moved slowly to the door of the room. Her heart felt like it was squeezing in her chest. As he slowly opened the door, the pungent smell of antiseptic and the intense silence shook him. Arthur was lying there, hooked up to cables and monitors. His face was pale, his breathing ragged. A man who had repaired countless engines with his own hands in his lifetime, who had brought back to life even machines that were considered inoperable. Now his own body was failing him. Morgan sat on the side of the bed and looked at Arthur's hands, greasy and calloused hands, hands that carried years of labor, hands that were tired from working but always reassuring. Now they were cold and weak. His eyes misted over. "Hey, old man," he said slowly, his voice soft but broken. "This shouldn't have happened." Arthur's eyelids fluttered. His eyes widened slightly, and he looked at Morgan with a tired but familiar smile. "Did the car break down?" he whispered. Morgan laughed lightly, but his voice was shaking. "No, I got it running, but you're the one that needs fixing, buddy." Arthur blinked and stared at the ceiling. He was having trouble breathing. "You know," he said with difficulty, "people are like cars. They run for a while, but then their engines get tired." Morgan tried to hold back her tears, but the knot in her throat grew tighter. "But you You paved the way for so many people, Arthur. People like you are hard to find." Arthur shook his head slightly from side to side. His eyes were far away. "My granddaughter, Olivia. Take care of her." Morgan felt that Arthur was thinking of his granddaughter even with his last breath. He was a man who devoted his life to others. Morgan placed his hand over Arthur's and whispered, "Don't worry, my friend. Olivia will go to the best schools. They'll have everything they need." Arthur's eyes filled with tears. His lips trembled. "Don't forget me, Morgan. A man lives as long as those who remember him." Morgan shook his head. "I will never forget you, Arthur Beckett." Arthur smiled slightly. His eyes opened one last time, and then slowly closed. The lines on the monitor flattened. Morgan felt empty inside. He felt as if he had lifted a rock and found a huge void beneath it. He was alone in the room. Arthur was gone. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks. Arthur's funeral was simple but full of meaning. People came from all over the neighborhood. The cars he had repaired were parked on the streets, decorated with flowers. Olivia was sobbing over her grandfather's coffin. His wife hugged her grandson in tears. Morgan was there too. His heart was squeezing. He took a step, crouched down next to Olivia, and looked her in the eyes. "Things are going to be different from now on," he said. "I promise you and your grandmother that I will be there for you, whatever you need." Olivia raised her teary eyes to Morgan. In her tiny body, she was carrying a pain too great for a child to bear. "Grandpa always said, good people disappear, but if we never forget them, they never really go anywhere." Morgan's eyes filled again. "Arthur hasn't gone anywhere, Olivia. He will always be with us." And Morgan vowed to keep Arthur's dream alive. Olivia would go to the best schools. Her grandmother would have no worries. And Arthur's garage would never close. Morgan bought it, put one of the old apprentices in charge. The shop's new sign read, "Beckett's Auto Repair, honest workmanship since 1974. Underneath was a small addition, "In honor of Arthur Beckett." And so, Arthur Beckett's name continued to live on, not only on a sign, but in the hearts of people as well. Because goodness never truly disappears. And Arthur was goodness.